Welcome back. In the early days of the American invasion of Iraq, the U.S. administration calculated that it was cheaper to hire private security firms than to commit more troops. Well, most of their work involves protecting staff and buildings such as embassies. The firms also provide some training, though. They're allowed to open fire to defend U.S. diplomats under their protection, and they enjoy the same immunity as U.S. or British soldiers serving in Iraq. Well, joining us are our guests once again in New York, Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist. He's the author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. And in London, Sabah al-Mukhtar, an international lawyer. If I could start with Jeremy once again. Private contractors have long been used in conflicts, haven't they? But have things reached new heights in Iraq when you look at the sort of missions they're being asked to go on?
Well, absolutely. And I don't believe that the Bush administration simply hires these forces because they're cheaper. The Bush administration hires these forces because the world doesn't want the U.S. government occupying Iraq, and that's why you don't have nation-state militaries supporting this occupation. And so what's extraordinary about this development is you now have a larger corporate army occupying Iraq than you do a military. The fact is that the corporate sector is much bigger. And there's something very relevant here about what's happening with Blackwater. This isn't just any company that's operating in Iraq. This is the official mercenary company of the U.S. government. This means essentially that the Iraqi government is saying the personal bodyguards to Ambassador Ryan Crocker, to Condoleezza Rice when she visits Iraq, to U.S. congressional delegations, that they have to leave the country. And the fact is that Blackwater has kept every U.S. ambassador alive since Paul Bremer, and that's why you see Condoleezza Rice pushing back so strongly on this. I actually would be very surprised if Blackwater ends up being thrown out of Iraq. This is a very politically connected company that's incredibly close to the Bush administration.
All right, let's go to Sabah al-Mukhtar. You were talking earlier in part one about the problems of licensing these companies. I think the U.S. administration has been slow to even say whether Blackwater still has a valid license. How can you run a private army in a country without anyone's permission?
Well, this is exactly what the U.S. government is doing. It's attempting a two-pronged attack. Number one, it's withholding total information from the American public. It doesn't have to report about anything. Those are contractors, so we don't know how many being killed. Anybody who commits any crime there cannot be asked for. Nobody knows any
But surely the Iraqi government,
so
to interrupt you, must carry some of the responsibility here too. I mean, they have a role, don't they, to regulate what's going on in their country?
Well, the problem with this question is assuming the Iraqi government is an Iraqi government. That one is really a fishy government, which is appointed by the Americans. This is a group of people who were imported from outside Iraq, mostly from the West, and some of them from the neighboring country, from Iran, from Saudi Arabia. Even one of them carries the UAE nationality. So those people are they are Iraqis by origin, but at the present moment, the regime there in Iraq does not control anything in Iraq. It controls even the green zoo, which they live in, they don't control that one, because they have to hand it over to the Blackwater to protect them. So this is not a government that controls anything. And if it did control anything, then the problem would be even worse. This government should not be talking about revoking a license, should not be talking about, they should arrest those people if there is a government, if there is a sovereign government. But this is part of the humiliation of the U.S. government to this regime.
Let's look forward a little bit to whatever solutions could be brought to the table. And let's look at some points raised back in June 2006 in a report from the U.S. government's Accountability Office, which said private security providers continue to enter the battle space without coordinating with the U.S. military, putting both the military and security providers at a greater risk of injury. Let's go over to Jeremy and ask, is the solution they be brought under U.S. military command?
No, I think that the United States Congress needs to pass anti-mercenary legislation, as was passed last year in South Africa. What's happened here is that the U.S. government has allowed an intimate linking of corporate profits and war making. The more violent and bloody it gets in Iraq, the greater the profits for these companies. That means that they actually benefit from an increase in chaos. And this shouldn't be allowed in the international community. And the fact is that the Bush administration has scorned international law and diplomacy, and that's why we see this mercenary system out of control. To directly answer your question, though, the U.S. military itself sees this as very problematic because when the mercenaries go in and they shoot up a village, oftentimes what happens is that Iraqis will carry out a revenge attack against the official U.S. military, and the U.S. military sees these guys as cowboys and Wild West participants, and so there's a great deal of consternation even within the official military at the conduct of these individuals. But I believe firmly that the U.S. Congress needs to ban mercenary activity, particularly when it's being carried out in the names of the U.S. people.
But in reality, we know, and you pointed out, that there's more private contractors as a whole, if not armed security personnel. Some might dispute that, but there's plenty of private security contractors and private contractors in the country. The U.S. military and U.S. authorities need them. They don't have the support, as you put it, from world nations to carry out the job alone. It's never going to happen. So looking on a practical level, some would say at least clauses, for example, of the 2007 defense budget could have been activated and used by the Pentagon to try and bring security personnel, private security personnel, under military codes. Wouldn't that be something of a solution?
Well, we do have a law on the books now because of an adjustment to the Defense Authorization Bill last year that says that contractors can be tried under the military court-martial system. But let's be clear here. The majority of the American people are against this war. The majority of the Iraqi people want the U.S. out. The majority of the world is against it. What does this say about the existence of nation states? Who's occupying Iraq? Is this a government of the United States, or is it a corporate army? And so in a way, it's sort of a false question. The real question here is, why is the United States remaining in Iraq when the vast majority of the world, including its own citizens, want it out?
Well, let's take a look at what the Iraqi citizens, or at least some of them, wanted. According to U.S. Colonel Peter Mansour, who said if they shoot up, of course here he's referring to private security personnel, if they shoot up a car that looks suspicious, whatever it may be, they may be operating within their contract, but to the detriment of the mission, which is to bring the people over to your side. Now over to Sabah Mukhtar. These private security firms perhaps further alienating the U.S. forces, even the Iraqi government, from its people.
Well, we can talk about all these issues, but we must also remember that when 4 of the Blackwater contractors were killed in Fallujah, we all know what happened with the U.S. Army when they destroyed the city of Fallujah, made everybody a refugee, killed lots of people in revenge for 4 mercenaries who were there in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's not try and put all the blame on the security firms when the U.S. Army itself has committed so many atrocities, from Abu Ghraib to the killing of innocents, and until now we have not seen anybody who's been brought to justice. And I'm talking about the civilized USA with its legislation, forgetting about Bremer and forgetting about the Iraqis and international law. This is a disgrace on a nation of that magnitude to allow crimes of this nature to be carried out, whether by the army or by the private security companies, for whom the U.S. government, out of taxpayers' money, paying hundreds of millions of dollars to commit these crimes in front of their eyes. No action is being taken by anybody. It is told to try and get Maliki government, which is imposed on Iraq, to deal with this issue, when the U.S. government itself should have taken the action, rather than trying to undermine even the complaint which came from Maliki. It's really told to try and put the blame on these private security companies. At the end of the day, those are mercenaries, are there putting their life for money, and they are making the money, both individuals and companies. All
right, Jeremy Sabah, they're clearly making the case of putting more blame on the U.S. authorities. Maybe you could say it's a cynical view, but some would argue that perhaps the Pentagon doesn't really want the responsibility for the actions of these private security corporations, and prefers that they work in some kind of legal black hole. Would you agree with that, or is that too cynical?
Oh, you're hitting the nail on the head there. I mean, I think that's the very essence of it. The Bush administration gains a tremendous amount from using these shadow forces. The deaths of these guys aren't counted when they're killed in the official death toll, so it masks the cost of American lives. Their crimes, when they commit them, largely have gone undocumented and unreported, and they certainly have not been prosecuted. And the Bush administration is able to effectively double the size of the U.S. occupation of Iraq without having to tell the American people that there are close to 400,000 personnel on the U.S. government payroll that are occupying Iraq. And that doesn't even include the puppet government that was established by the U.S. Military in Iraq. So clearly the Bush administration benefits from having a shadow army. What's the difference? One Congress member on the Oversight Committee in the U.S. Congress said to me recently, what's the difference between covert activities and overt activities over which you have no oversight? And that's really what these mercenary forces are about. It gives the Bush administration plausible deniability. It's a private company, not the military. But the fact is that they are there representing the U.S. taxpayers, and that's what particularly makes it an incredible violation of the spirit of any semblance of democracy in the United States.
All right, I'm afraid we're running out of time. We're going to have to leave the discussion there. Jeremy Scahill, an investigative journalist, and Sabah Al-Mukhtar, international lawyer, thank you both for being with us. I should also mention that we did invite U.S. officials to join us here in this episode of Inside Story. Unfortunately, they were unable to attend. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. For now, it's goodbye.